The hum of the cabin was broken by a sharp, cutting voice. "Excuse me," called out Victoria Langston, her tone dripping with condescension as she waved down a flight attendant. "Is this Derrick Cole flying us today?" "Like Derrick Cole." She emphasized his last name like it carried some hidden scandal. Her designer sunglasses perched atop her bleach blonde hair only added to the air of superiority she exuded. Around her, murmurs began to ripple through first class. A man in an expensive suit leaned over to his companion. "You think they'd let just anyone fly these things? I mean, look at his name." The implication hung heavy in the air. His name didn't sound right to them. In the cockpit, Derrick adjusted his headset, oblivious to the growing unrest. He had spent years proving himself in an industry that often doubted him simply because of the color of his skin. But today felt different. There was a tension brewing, one he couldn't quite place yet. Back in the cabin, Victoria pressed further. "I'm not saying he can't do his job. I'm just asking if he's qualified. It's a valid question." Her words were met with nods from those around her, their agreement fueling her audacity. Little did she know, her casual racism would soon spiral into something far more explosive. As the whispers grew louder, the flight attendant hesitated before responding diplomatically. "Captain Cole is one of our most experienced pilots, ma'am. You're in good hands." But even as she spoke, doubt lingered in her voice, a subtle betrayal Derrick had learned to recognize all too well. Unbeknownst to everyone, the intercom system flickered briefly, unnoticed by both passengers and crew. And then, without warning, Victoria's next biting remark echoed throughout the entire plane. Victoria's voice cut through the cabin like a knife. "Honestly, I don't care what you say. He doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Do we even know how long he's been flying? Or if he actually knows what he's doing?" Her laughter rang out, cruel and dismissive, followed by scattered chuckles from others seated nearby. But instead of fading into silence, her words reverberated, unnaturally, amplified by the live mic now broadcasting her every syllable. Gasps erupted across the plane as passengers realized what had happened. In the cockpit, Derrick froze mid-checklist, his jaw tightening as the venomous comments reached. "Him loud and clear. Turn it off," someone shouted from the back of the plane, but the damage was done. Every passenger heard Victoria's unfiltered disdain, and worse, they knew Derrick could hear it too. For a moment, the cabin fell silent, the weight of collective shame pressing down on everyone except Victoria herself. Oblivious to the exposure, she continued ranting until the flight attendant finally managed to switch off the intercom. Derrick clenched the controls, forcing himself to breathe steadily. He'd faced discrimination before countless times, but rarely so publicly or brazenly. Still, professionalism dictated his response, or lack thereof. He couldn't afford to react, not when dozens of lives depended on his focus. Yet, deep down, anger simmered alongside humiliation. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black professional who'd ever been doubted simply for existing in spaces others deemed theirs alone. And as much as he wanted to confront the situation head-on, duty came first. Little did anyone realize, though, that the turbulence ahead wouldn't just come from the storm clouds gathering outside. Minutes later, Derrick's radio crackled to life. "Flight 472, be advised. Severe weather systems developing along your route. Recommend altitude adjustment to avoid potential hazards." The controller's voice was calm but firm, hinting at trouble brewing miles above the earth. Derrick acknowledged the transmission, his mind racing. Weather patterns like this weren't uncommon, but something about the timing felt ominous. As he relayed instructions to co-pilot Greg Hayes, the atmosphere in the cockpit grew tense. Greg glanced sideways at Derrick, sensing the shift in energy. "You okay, Captain?" he asked cautiously, unsure whether to address the elephant in the room, or rather the insult still echoing in their ears. "I'm fine," Derrick replied curtly, though his clipped tone betrayed otherwise. He focused intently on recalculating their trajectory, pushing aside thoughts of Victoria's mockery. For now, survival took precedence over indignation. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, the mood remained uneasy. Passengers whispered anxiously about the earlier incident, some embarrassed, others defiantly agreeing with Victoria under their breath. No one dared approach the cockpit, yet the tension seemed to seep through the walls themselves. And as the storm clouds gathered ominously outside, the emotional tempest within the plane showed no signs of abating either. If anything, it was only the beginning. The murmurs in first class grew louder, a cacophony of thinly veiled insults directed at Derrick. Victoria Langston leaned forward again, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Greg," she called out, addressing the co-pilot who had come to address passenger concerns. "Can you confirm that he is actually flying this plane? Because honestly, I'd feel better knowing someone with, let's say, more experience was handling things." Greg shifted uncomfortably, caught between professionalism and appeasement. "Captain Cole has over 15 years of experience, ma'am. He's one of the best pilots we have. Experience doesn't always mean competence," another passenger chimed in, his tone laced with skepticism. The comment drew murmurs of agreement from those seated around him. In the cockpit, Derrick could hear fragments of the conversation through the open intercom line, a technical oversight no one had bothered to fix after the earlier mishap. Each word felt like a dagger, piercing deeper than any insult he'd faced before. Yet he remained silent, focusing instead on adjusting their altitude as turbulence began to rock the plane. Greg returned to the cockpit, visibly uneasy. "They're restless out there," he muttered, avoiding eye contact with Derrick. "Maybe you should make an announcement, reassure them or something." Derrick raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll believe me if I tell them everything's fine?" His tone was calm but carried an edge of bitterness. Greg didn't respond, but his hesitation spoke volumes. As the whispers continued in the cabin, tension mounted. Passengers clutched armrests, glancing nervously toward the cockpit. For many, it wasn't just about Derrick's race. It was about power dynamics they couldn't quite articulate but were determined to uphold. And as the turbulence worsened, so did their unease. Derrick's mind drifted momentarily, drawn, back to a time when rejection wasn't just personal, it was institutional. He remembered sitting across from his supervisor, a white man named Harris, during what should have been a routine performance review. "You're talented, Derrick," Harris had said, leaning back in his chair. "But leadership roles require a certain image, you understand? Image." That single word had haunted Derrick ever since. It wasn't just Harris. It was every promotion board, every hiring committee that overlooked him despite his impeccable record. Men with half his qualifications were elevated while he remained grounded, not because he lacked skill, but because he didn't fit their mold. Back in the present, Derrick gripped the controls tighter, forcing himself to focus. Those memories weren't just ghosts. They were scars that shaped how he navigated both the skies and the systemic barriers within his profession. Greg noticed Derrick's clenched jaw and hesitated before speaking. "Look, Captain, I know they can be harsh sometimes, but nothing." Derrick interrupted, his voice low but firm. "You don't need to defend them. Just do your job." The unspoken truth hung heavy between them. Derrick knew Greg meant well, but even allies could waver under pressure. And as the storm outside intensified, so did the cracks forming in their fragile partnership. Unbeknownst to Derrick, Victoria's influence extended far beyond her biting remarks. As passengers whispered among themselves, one businessman revealed the full scope of her reach. "Did you know she's the CEO's daughter?" he said smugly, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. "If anyone complains loud enough, heads will roll." The revelation spread quickly, fueling the growing resentment toward Derrick. To these passengers, Victoria wasn't just a vocal critic. She was a gatekeeper of power, capable of shaping careers with a single phone call. In the cockpit, Greg received a discreet message from the flight attendant confirming Victoria's identity. His face paled as he processed the implications. If she followed through on her threats, Derrick's career could be over before the plane even touched down. Derrick sensed Greg's unease but chose not to press him. Instead, he focused on stabilizing the aircraft as turbulence rocked them harder than before. Outside, storm clouds loomed ominously. mirroring the chaos brewing inside the cabin and within his own team. For now, Derrick pushed aside thoughts of retaliation or revenge. Survival came first. But the knowledge that his antagonist wielded such unchecked power gnawed at him, adding another layer of weight to an already unbearable situation. The turbulence escalated sharply, jolting the plane violently. Passengers screamed, clutching seatbelts and armrests as items tumbled from overhead compartments. Even seasoned travelers exchanged panicked glances, their earlier disdain for Derrick giving way to sheer terror. In the cockpit, alarms blared intermittently as Derrick fought to maintain control. "We need to climb above this," he instructed Greg, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Greg nodded, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "Do you think we can outrun it?" he asked, his tone betraying uncertainty. "We don't have a choice," Derrick replied curtly. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Victoria gripped her seat tightly, her bravado crumbling under the reality of their predicament. For all her complaints about Derrick, she hadn't considered the possibility of actual danger until now. Her fear morphed into guilt, but only briefly. As the plane bucked and shuddered, the fragile trust between Derrick and Greg began to fray further. Neither spoke openly about it, but the strain was palpable. Something had shifted, not just in the weather but in the dynamic between them. And as the storm raged on, the fractures in their partnership threatened to widen into chasms. During a brief lull in the turbulence, Greg leaned closer to Derrick, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Listen, Captain, I'm just saying, maybe they have a point. About the company image, I mean. People expect certain things." Derrick froze, his hands tightening on the controls. "Are you serious right now?" he demanded, incredulous. "You agree with them?" "It's not about agreeing," Greg stammered, backpedaling. "It's about managing expectations. These people are scared and what? They'd feel safer if I handed over the controls to you?" Derrick shot back, his voice cutting like steel. Greg fell silent, unable to meet Derrick's gaze. The betrayal stung worse than any insult from the passengers. At a moment when unity mattered most, Derrick found himself standing alone. Again, outside, lightning illuminated the darkened sky, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. The storm showed no signs of abating, and neither did the emotional tempest brewing within the plane. With each passing second, the stakes grew higher and the fractures deeper. Just as the turbulence seemed to ease, a deafening roar filled the cabin as one of the engines sputtered and died. Alarms screamed in the cockpit, red warning lights flashing urgently. Derrick acted instinctively, initiating emergency protocols. "While barking orders at Greg, secure the auxiliary systems," he commanded, his voice razor-sharp. "And prep for possible diversion. We'll need alternate landing options pronto." Greg scrambled to comply, his earlier doubts replaced by adrenaline-fueled urgency. Meanwhile, air traffic control delivered. Devastating news. Flight 472, nearest airport is unavailable due to hazardous conditions. Repeat, no safe landing options currently available. Derrick absorbed the information without flinching, though his heart pounded furiously. Behind him, chaos erupted in the cabin as passengers realized the gravity of the situation. Cries of panic echoed through the thin walls of the cockpit, amplifying the pressure. For a fleeting moment, Derrick allowed himself to wonder if this was karma, the universe punishing him for years of enduring prejudice without fighting back. But almost immediately he shoved the thought aside. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about survival, for everyone on board. With grim determination, Derrick prepared to execute maneuvers he hadn't attempted since his military days. But even as he took decisive action, he couldn't shake the feeling that the greatest challenges lay not outside, but within. The cockpit was a cacophony of alarms and flashing lights as Derrick barked orders with precision. "Greg, I need you on auxiliary power systems now." His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, leaving no room for hesitation. In the cabin, panic reached fever pitch. Passengers screamed as the plane lurched violently, the remaining engines straining under the weight of keeping them airborne. Victoria Langston stormed toward the cockpit, her face flushed with fury. "What are you doing? You're going to get us killed," she shouted, her usual composure shattered. Derrick ignored her, focusing instead on the instruments in front of him. Over the intercom, he addressed the terrified passengers. "This is Captain Cole. I know you're scared, but I need everyone to stay calm and follow instructions. We will get through this together." His words carried authority, but Greg hesitated, his earlier betrayal still lingering between them. "Are you sure about this maneuver?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't have time to second-guess myself," Derrick replied, his tone sharp yet controlled. "And neither do you. Now focus." As the storm raged outside, Derrick's mind raced. He'd faced situations like this before, not exactly, but close enough that muscle memory began to kick in. The violent turbulence forced him to adapt quickly, drawing on skills honed over years of experience. But it wasn't just technical expertise guiding him. It was something deeper, something buried in his past. Derrick's thoughts flashed back to a night during his Navy days, a mission gone wrong over hostile territory. His aircraft had been hit, one engine failing mid-flight. The memory was vivid, the deafening roar of wind, the acrid smell of smoke, the icy grip of fear clawing at his chest. But he hadn't panicked then, and he wouldn't now. That night, he'd executed a daring maneuver, gliding the damaged plane to safety using nothing but skill and determination. It had earned him commendations and saved countless lives, but more importantly, it had taught him resilience. Back in the present, Derrick adapted that same technique, adjusting their trajectory to glide toward a narrow window of opportunity. The remote airstrip ahead wasn't ideal, but it was their only chance. Greg watched in awe as Derrick worked, his earlier doubts melting away. "You really can pull this off," he murmured, half to himself. "Not if you keep distracting me," Derrick shot back, though there was less venom in his tone now. For the first time since the crisis began, they were working as a team, or at least moving in the same direction. Still, the emotional storm wasn't over. As the plane descended, Victoria pushed her way into the cockpit, her hysteria reaching new heights. "You're incompetent," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at Derrick. Without missing a beat, Derrick turned to her, his expression unreadable. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, including himself, he extended a hand toward the controls. Victoria froze, staring at Derrick as though he'd lost his mind. "What?" she stammered, her bravado faltering. "You heard me?" Derrick said calmly, gesturing toward the controls. "If you think you can do better, go ahead. Prove us all wrong." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For all her arrogance, she had no idea how to fly a plane, let alone navigate one through a raging storm. The realization hit her hard, humiliation replacing her earlier indignation. I didn't mean," she sputtered, backing away from the cockpit. Derrick turned back to the instruments, his focus unwavering. "Then sit down, shut up, and let me do my job." Greg suppressed a smirk, watching as Victoria retreated to her seat, visibly shaken. For once, the tables had turned. The woman who had mocked Derrick's competence was now exposed as utterly clueless. Outside, lightning illuminated the darkened sky as the plane approached the makeshift landing strip. Every second counted, and Derrick knew there was no margin for error. With steely determination, he prepared to execute the impossible. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, sending vibrations rippling through the cabin. Passengers gasped, bracing themselves as the plane skidded along the uneven surface of the remote airstrip. For a moment, it seemed like they might overrun the runway entirely. But then, with a final lurch, the aircraft came to a stop. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. Then, slowly, cheers erupted throughout the cabin. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces as relief washed over them. Derrick exhaled deeply, his hands still gripping the controls. They'd made it, not without damage, but alive nonetheless. Beside him, Greg let out a shaky laugh. "You did it, Captain. You actually pulled it off." Before Derrick could respond, The door to the cockpit burst open. Several passengers rushed in, thanking him profusely. Even those who had doubted him earlier offered heartfelt apologies, their earlier prejudice forgotten in the wake of survival. But amidst the celebration, Derrick noticed something odd. One of the flight attendants approached him, holding a small doublet. On the screen was footage, CCTV from earlier in the flight. What he saw left him speechless. The footage played silently on the tablet, showing Victoria discreetly slipping an envelope to Greg in the galley. Inside were documents detailing a bribe, an offer to sabotage Derrick's career in exchange for financial compensation. Greg swallowed hard, guilt etched across his face. "I recorded it," he admitted reluctantly, "just in case she tried to turn on me later. I never intended." Derrick stared at him, his expression unreadable. Betrayal stung twice as sharply when it came from someone you trusted, even indirectly. But there was no time to dwell on it. The implications of Victoria's actions would ripple far beyond this flight, exposing layers of corruption within the airline industry. As authorities boarded the plane to assess the situation, Derrick stepped aside, allowing events to unfold. Justice would come, but for now, he took solace in knowing that he'd proven his worth not just as a pilot, but as a leader. Yet even as the dust settled, Derrick couldn't help but wonder how many others like Victoria existed, wielding power to perpetuate bias, and how many more battles would he have to fight before systemic change became a reality. By the time the passengers disembarked, the footage of Victoria's bribery attempt had already begun circulating online. Someone, likely a flight attendant seeking accountability, had leaked it to social media. Within hours, the clip went viral, sparking outrage across platforms. Comment sections erupted with condemnation. "This is why systemic racism persists," one user wrote. Another added, "She tried to sabotage a qualified pilot because of is race? Unbelievable." The hashtag #ShunkerJustice for Derrick trended worldwide, shining a spotlight not just on Victoria, but on the broader issues of bias in aviation. For Victoria Langston, the fallout was swift and merciless. Her father, the airline's major shareholder, publicly distanced himself from her actions, issuing a statement that read, "Her behavior does not reflect our values as a company." Shortly after, she was stripped of her position on the board, her influence evaporating overnight. Meanwhile, Derrick became an overnight sensation. News outlets hailed him as a hero, not only for saving hundreds of lives, but for enduring blatant discrimination with grace under pressure. Interviews poured in, each interviewer eager to hear his perspective. Yet, Derrick remained measured, refusing to revel in Victoria's downfall. "It's not about revenge," he told one journalist during a live segment. "It's about exposing the truth so we can prevent this kind of injustice from happening again." His words resonated deeply, turning what could have been a personal victory into a rallying cry for change. But behind the scenes, questions linger about how the truth had come to light and who had played a role in ensuring justice was served. For Greg Hayes, the co-pilot whose betrayal had nearly cost them everything, the weight of his actions and inactions was becoming too heavy to bear. Days later, Greg approached Derrick outside the airline headquarters, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. "Captain Cole, I need to explain something," he began, his voice low. Derrick raised an eyebrow, waiting silently for Greg to continue. "The recording. I made it," Greg admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "Not because I wanted to help. I did it to protect myself. I thought if she turned on me later, I'd have leverage." Derrick studied him, his gaze piercing yet unreadable. "And instead it ended up helping me." Greg nodded, shame coloring his features. "Yeah, but I know that doesn't excuse what I did, or said, on the plane. I let my fear get the better of me, and I betrayed your trust when you needed me most." For a moment, Derrick said nothing, letting the weight of Greg's confession settle between them. Finally, he spoke, his tone firm but not unkind. "You're right, it doesn't excuse it. But owning up to your mistakes is a start. Don't waste this chance to make things right." As Greg walked away, Derrick felt a flicker of hope. Betrayal was painful, but redemption was possible, even for those who stumbled along the way. And while Greg's intentions might have been self-serving, the outcome had sparked a chain reaction that could lead to real change. Still, Derrick knew the fight wasn't over. Exposing Victoria's scheme was just the beginning. There were deeper roots to unearth, roots embedded in decades of systemic bias within the industry. And as much as the world celebrated him now, Derrick understood that true progress would require more than applause. That evening, Derrick sat at the kitchen table with his wife Tasha, the events of the past few days weighing heavily on him. "They're calling me a hero," he said quietly, shaking his head. "But all I did was my job." Tasha reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "It's more than that, Derrick. You stood tall in the face of hatred, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. That's what makes you a hero." Her words struck a chord, reminding Derrick of the countless battles he'd fought silently. Throughout his career, each promotion denied, each sideways glance, each whispered insult had chipped away at him, but also strengthened his resolve. "I've spent years trying to prove myself," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But no matter how many lives I save or accolades I earn, there will always be people like Victoria who refuse to see me as equal. It's exhausting." Tasha squeezed his hand. "Then maybe it's time to stop fighting alone. Use your platform, Derrick. Mentor young pilots, speak out against bias, and show the next generation that they deserve to be here just as much as anyone else." Her suggestion ignited something within him, a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about vindication, it was about legacy. If he could pave the way for others, then every struggle he'd endured would be worth it. With newfound clarity, Derrick vowed to dedicate himself to dismantling the barriers that had once held him back. He wouldn't let another talented pilot face the same obstacles he had, not if he could help it. Weeks later, Derrick stood before a group of wide-eyed aspiring pilots at a local aviation academy. Most of them were young black students, their faces alight with ambition and determination. "When I started flying," Derrick began, his voice steady and warm, "there weren't many people who looked like me in the cockpit. Some told me I didn't belong there, that I wasn't good enough. But I refused to believe them." He paused, scanning the room. "You'll face challenges too. People will doubt you, question your abilities, and sometimes outright dismiss you because of the color of your skin. But remember this, you are capable, you are worthy, and you have a community standing behind you." The students listened intently, hanging on his every word. For many, Derrick represented proof that success was possible despite the odds. Afterward, a young woman approached him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "Hearing your story makes me feel like I can actually do this." Derrick smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can. And when things get tough, remind yourself why you started. Then look around. You'll never have to face it alone." As he watched the students disperse, their energy buzzing with excitement, Derrick felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was where real change began, not in headlines or hashtags, but in nurturing the dreams of those who came after him. Though the scars of prejudice would always remain, Derrick knew he'd transformed his pain into purpose. And as long as he continued mentoring the next generation, the skies would grow a little brighter for everyone. This story highlights the courage it takes to rise above prejudice and fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. If this resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How can we all contribute to breaking down barriers in our own lives? Your voice matters. Share this video to spark conversations about equality and accountability. Hit like if you believe in standing up against bias, and subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Together, let's turn these moments of awareness into action.